Welcome to Weekly Wins and Losses. My name is James Hepner, former real estate entrepreneur turned self-development hacker, coach, and fulfillment strategist. Each week, we bring you a thought to wrestle with that'll help you live fully alive and gain more life. Real life is made up of both wins and losses. Both were designed for your good. That's basic reality. Without facing and learning how to embrace your losses for greater gain, you miss out. You leave 50% of your life experience on the table. So with that, let's begin the show. When I originally thought to begin this podcast, folks, I honestly never thought I would have this many of you people listening. Frankly, I'm blown away and I'm thankful for each one of you. Now, there's a couple of things I just wanted to share. Many of you have been reaching out to inquire about working with me, and the questions, well, they all seem to stem and follow a similar pattern. So I wanted to be helpful and I wanted to make your understanding of what that could look like super easy for you to understand. Let me tell you a little bit more about my actual business. I do live events like retreats and keynote speaking. I do group and one-on-one coaching. And I also host a no-charge Friday noon virtual weekly wins and losses global call. Now, I have to say, there is a difference between the one-on-one strategic results coaching experience and the live group work like virtual weekly wins and losses global call. The one-on-one coaching experience and its strategic results coaching goes super deep. And this is for all of you, those that are deeply hungry for that ultimate personal transformational experience. Because it's just you and we get to get beneath the surface of your individual experience of life, we get to align with your strengths, and from that place, sculpt, craft, and design a personal success and fulfillment formula that is unique to you. Again, this is for those that are hungry and want it all. Now, the virtual weekly wins and losses global call is frankly quite the experience. And frankly, for me, it's one of the better ways, if not the best way, to bring raw truth to what your last week is really all about. Now, I know I'm kind of biased, but I do think so. It's no charge and happens every Friday at noon. Jumping onto this simple call will deliver a profound experience for you as you'll clear the deck of all the unhelpful stings of the last week's losses so that when your new week begins, you're best able to launch out of the gate invigorated and ready to take bold, courageous action without the unhelpful side of hesitation and delay. I invite each one of you to show up and share as you wish, or simply observe others share a personal win and personal loss that stood out for them from the past week. Come and master the art of being prepared for anything. Win, lose, or draw. Come and learn how to authentically celebrate both a win and a loss in real time every time. So for live events, keynote speaking, group and one-on-one strategic results coaching, simply go to www.jameshepner.com. And for the no-charge virtual weekly wins and losses global call happening every Friday at noon, simply go to www.weeklywinsandlosses.com. Go halfway down the page, click on the link that says join this Friday call. So now, please sit back and enjoy this free information. I challenge you to engage with it. And I sincerely hope it brings you value and stirs you to that needed new perspective, and maybe, just maybe, even brings an important question to the surface of your life that'll help you clarify your next move forward. So may this episode number 27 integrate and utilize the darkness, change your everyday life. Welcome, friends. Today we have on the show a gentleman by the name of Dylan Sessler. Dylan is a mental health coach, professional speaker, podcast host of the Dylan Experience, entrepreneur, combat veteran, and author of the book DEFY the Darkness, a story of suicide, mental health, and overcoming your hardest battles. In January of 2020, Dylan began speaking on TikTok about mental health and trauma. By 2022, he has accumulated more than 500,000 followers supporting his daily content centered around having a realistic conversation about things like mental health, abuse, trauma, self-harm, and suicide. His relentless pursuit has allowed him to impact the lives of millions while also developing a platform to help society rethink human connection and mental health. Dylan, welcome to the show.
Appreciate you having me, James.
I've been looking forward to this conversation. A friend of mine, I was on, I had one of your people on. Jonathan was on my
Yep.
podcast, and he says, you got to meet this Dylan guy. I was just on his talk. He's a real dude. And it's interesting. I went online and I see this guy, he's wearing a hat, and I'm like, yeah, this guy's a real dude. There's just something about it, about you that resonates realness. So thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Jonathan's great. And my first experience was with Jonathan was on that, I can't remember which podcast it was, but he had Chris and I think it was Caitlin as well. And we just had this really in-depth conversation. And I love that kind of concept and having those conversations is always, it's a healthy debate. It's a respectful debate. And it just, it just really connects you with good people. I love that idea.
Something that caught me right quick is having a realistic conversation.
Yeah.
Realistic, right? A lot of people, we want the realistic, but then often when there's these little scratches within our life or these edges that are a little rough, like mental health, abuse, trauma, self-harm, suicide, people tend to just glaze over that stuff. And then when it gets real, it just gets really, so just as a disclaimer here, I was sexually abused when I was really young. I've moved through it, right? And I've suffered. When you say mental health, I had a story that I came through back in 2011, 2012. I forget the exact year, but it's something that I've struggled with for much. Now, let me be honest, through school, high school, junior high, elementary, just really struggling with all of the voices going on and so much happening. And how do you utilize all of this? And so one of the things that I try to do is I try to unload and eliminate some of it. However, that never worked for me.
Yeah.
Right. I had to learn how to use it and bring in. But talk to me. What does this realistic conversation look like for you?
I think we've always kind of been pandered this idea that talking about mental health needs to be optimistic, right? Where it needs to be, not even necessarily just optimistic, but also quite pessimistic in its own realm. If there's that trinity of optimism, pessimism, realism, and I never liked either of optimism or pessimism because it focuses so much on, just kind of pushing it aside, brushing it under the rug. It's not going to be a problem if you just don't think about it. Stop focusing on it. Just like it doesn't really solve any problems to be optimistic or realistic, or optimistic or pessimistic. Solving problems requires an understanding of what is good, what is bad, and being very intentional about what those actually mean. So realism to me in this conversation of mental health requires you to understand so many different things. It requires you to dig into the heart of all of your issues, right? You've been through your own issues. And so it requires you to understand, your family dynamics. It requires you to understand the brain. It requires you to understand the body. It requires you to understand perception and perspective. And so all of this stuff that I talk about now is all the stuff that I never learned as a kid, and I didn't go through what you went through, but I lost my dad to suicide at 6 years old. Wow. And that completely transforms a child's life, as you can imagine. And I didn't get that, understanding of how to deal with shame, how to deal with guilt, how to deal with regret, how to deal with loss, how to deal with trauma. And what I try to do now is I try to help people have that realistic conversation that helps them understand that this is a hard thing to do, no matter who you are, but it's a possible thing to recover from, to find peace, to find balance, to find your own, level of happiness. And I always kind of look at the meaning of life. And I heard this a long time. I can't remember where, but I think the meaning of life is to enjoy the passage of time. And so if you want to eventually find that meaning within your own life or craft it, it requires being able to understand that not everything is going to allow you to enjoy the passage of time. And you have to find the ways to justify and shift things around to make yourself learn how to enjoy life again after all of the trauma and the tragedy that befalls the human experience. That makes sense.
Meaning of life. I love your answer. engaging the passing of time. Some would say to the exact degree that you can enjoy and comfortably enjoy the uncertainties that you're given is
Yeah.
to the exact degree you're going to actually, enjoy life. And so what's fascinating when I think about, and just bringing right to the surface. So sorry to hear that you had to go through that experience at such a young age and lost your dad. I mean, let's be honest, death is final.
Mm-hmm.
Questions like why, what part did I have to do to play with it? I can only imagine the right, the shame. It's just the
Yep.
subtleness and pushing things down. We just realized doesn't really work.
Right.
It's just going to come to the surface, and
Yep.
probably at a very inopportune time. And
Yep.
so the passing of time. So when I think about there you are, there your time is passing, and you're going, am I enjoying my life? And I don't want to speak into your experience, but I can only imagine there is a certain point in time when we have to reconcile the reality of what actually happened. It was something that was real. We can
Yep.
say it's dark and push the darkness away. And again, I find if we push what has been away and just cloud it over and say it wasn't, that's not identifying with an actual real life experience. Think about how when you tell yourself something didn't happen, but it actually did, think about what you're giving yourself. Like you're not giving yourself really much of a chance to see
Yep.
reality in any other area.
Well, that's
You're not
why
really seeing clearly, right? Go ahead.
that's why my book isn't Deny the Darkness, it's Defy It, right?
Love it.
Because the darkness is an essential characteristic of life, right? And I look at life not necessarily just from the human perspective of, you know, we like to dominate the idea of life, of thinking that our perspective is the one and only. And I don't necessarily agree with that, because there's a whole teeming world and potentially outer world of life hanging around us. And so life itself, I like to look at things from a natural perspective where everything is surviving, everything is trying to survive. And so when you look at darkness, I mean, there's dark parts of the world, right? There's terrifying things in our world that do, terrifying, disgusting, disturbing things to other animals, other plants, other worldly items. And so there's darkness around us. That darkness has its own purpose. It has its own meaning. It does its own thing. But that light that we kind of look to requires, I think, for humans, for us, a choice. It requires us to choose to defy it, not deny, because if we deny its existence, we'll just succumb to it eventually. Someday it will destroy us. It will kill us. It will, we might end our own lives because of it. And so in very much opposition to that darkness, we must stand against it. We must choose our own path. We must choose our own meaning. We must choose our own life in itself. And I always find it interesting, when I ask people, what is your meaning of life? It's a very difficult question to answer. But I think in many regards, the answer always revolves around the very word that we're trying to derive meaning. It's life. I think it's almost a question that is its own answer, right? The meaning of life is life to me. And so the passage of time is its own thing. And it's like the passage of time is life in some regards. So it's a really interesting kind of thought concept to delve into, but we can't live our lives denying that what has happened hasn't happened. It just doesn't fit. It doesn't function for us. So it's an important thing to talk about and to communicate about.
How would you say you take something what society has deemed to be quite heavy and uncomfortable? So when I say uncomfortable, topics like, and you're probably cringing because, yeah, society says that mental health is uncomfortable. I'm cringing too because it's a reality for most people.
I'm laughing at this
Right?
point.
It's heavy. Actually, for you and I, it's like this is the lightness of life comes when we actually, right? Anyway,
Yeah.
so how do you how do you go about taking topics that the world says, society says, you should probably be approaching this from a really hesitant stance, just tiptoe around the edges, don't
Yeah.
poke it too much. Things like mental health, abuse, trauma, self-harm, suicide. How do you make this topic not a laughable one? Though laughing is a light version of,
Yeah.
some people laugh at funerals and that's how they process their pain. If that's how it works, that's how it works. But how do you take something that's heavy, society says anyway,
Yeah.
and how do you position yourself to acknowledge that for most people? Because I think most people just need us to acknowledge that what the world's taught them. We just, we don't say that it's evil right away, but we meet them where they're at, and then we
Right.
gently take them down, float down the river with them a little bit, right? How do you do
Yep.
this to take heavy, move it to light?
The answer is so remarkably simple. It's hilarious to me, and to do that process of like taking something that's so heavy in terms of societal function, like we can't talk about this, right? And that's what I grew up in. I grew up in this era of you can't talk about suicide. And so I never talked about my dad, right? Like I never talked about the very thing that traumatized me from the beginning. And what did that do to me? It destroyed me, right? And so what do I do now? I respectfully disagree, right? Like it's that simple. I just do not follow that mindset anymore. And so if you don't want to talk about it, that's fine, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about it, right? And so if people think it's taboo, if people think it's too heavy, if it's too dark, that's fine. That's not my journey, right? Because for some reason, the way I talk and the way I have conversations about mental health, suicide, trauma, abuse, all of these difficult topics to cover and have conversations about, there's 580 some thousand people that seem to think I've got something to say that's valuable, right? And I never would have guessed that, right? At 6 years old, I wouldn't, you tell me, you'd have this many followers. At that point, I'd be like, what's the internet? But, now I'm like, I never would have expected myself to get to this level of having these conversations at such a scale to understand. And I've really, it's only confirmed in my mind of how important it is to have these conversations, because there's so many people that look at my content and agree and understand and get it. Like we have this thought processing, and this is, I think, that pessimism I was talking about, is we have this thought processing that when we have this mental health issue of any sort, whether it's society, whether it's personal, we think nobody else gets it. And it's just fundamentally wrong, right? We retain this pessimism, and it's not realistic. It's like, there's 8 billion people on the planet. You don't think anybody's going through this or has gone through this. They have. And so the only logical way for me to understand how to solve that issue, talk about it. Because that's the only way you're going to understand that that's pessimism. It's not realism. Simple.
I love it. Such a distinct, like you say, a really simple answer. It's funny the amount of people you just listed, millions. Think about the billions of people that live.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, because if you'd ask me, I have yet to meet a person, when I really get into the marrow of their life, that their infrastructure doesn't reveal at one point in time, when I share even a bit of my story, that they can relate to having some thoughts about life that were a little bit more difficult. And so the inviting was, so here's often what I think, for those of us that have gone through things in life and actually are just willing not to run from it, and maybe not even run towards it.
Yeah.
But like you say, let life just sit with it.
Yep.
And it's totally safe beside me here to integrate that into my life. To be honest, I think we're like #blessed. I don't know what that means, but you know what I'm saying? Yeah. I think we're actually the lucky ones.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is ask yourself, but what manner of luck did we actually choose to show up within? We made the decision to create the luck because we just openly, I can see some stirring. Go ahead.
Well, I hate to say luck, right?
Yeah.
Because, and it's a hard concept, because how else do you explain it? People look into faith and they look into religion to explain the ideas of luck, miracles, all these things. Mm-hmm. But in many ways, I think the human experience, like we've been defined for millennia. We've been telling stories of how to overcome darkness. We've been telling narratives of this is how you deal with things. Has it always been right? No, but very much so. We've been taught stubbornness. We've been taught resilience. We've been taught this expansion of taking what's internal and making it external. That's art, right? That's it in its own realm. It's expression. It's theater. There's music. There's so many different things that we've been able to take from within the human to expose it and express it. And so this idea of empathy, right? That what very much related to, this idea of being relatable to other people. Empathy is as much a skill as it is kind of an intricate part of humanity. That's why we look at people that don't have empathy and are like, that's weird, right? Psychopaths and sociopaths are very weird because they don't have the one thing that all humans kind of connect with. It's empathy, right? It's the ability to connect with your fellow human and understand what they might be going through. And I just think at this stage in human development, we're struggling to maintain a definition of empathy that supports everybody. I don't think we really teach how to remain empathetic through things like mental health. And I think we're getting there. I think social media is kind of developing this idea for us. But again, there's still so much disconnection in the heaviness and the taboo and the stigma of the conversation that we still have work to do. And that's what you and I are trying to do. That's what we're here for. The blessed ones, as you say.
Yeah. It's not the weak ones that dive into it. It's the one that have the balls to maybe talk about it. And again, this is not exclusionary. It's just, we welcome whoever wants to join our party. Just come in. It'll be okay.
It's hard to say weak though, because when you look at humans, right? When you look at a baby that's traumatized for 12 years, can you call that person weak? Mm-hmm. I have a hard time saying that because that person was developmentally crafted to be stuck, right? They weren't given the opportunity. I like to look at like strength and weakness as an opportunity kind of thing.
100%, because at the end of the day, when you think about, so when you say strength and weakness, at the end of the day, we can make strong decisions or weak decisions. Yeah. The only thing is we've been neuroconditioned. Like you say, it's a 2 million-year-old brain. Perhaps we need to do a 2 million-year-old apology first and be like, well, I don't want to deal with empathy. I really don't want to deal with connection. And maybe first so speaking of empathy, I'm really curious how you might play off of this. The question I have for you, what do you think is at the base or at the infrastructure of societal conditioning that would have the human become, it seems so uninterested in the superpower of what it knows it's always had, which is to communicate in a way that the human has done before it learns how to talk. Empathy communicates before words ever come out. That's language. So what's there? What do you think has actually made people interested in following that narrative? Because, and again, you can take it wherever you want. Sometimes I feel like people are very openly interested in poking or pointing at the structure and saying, well, they're to blame. Mm-hmm. But I'm still looking at it from the angle of, but we still make choices to buy what they sell us. Now, what's your take?
I think culture, right? Because culture is both a construction of the entire society, so all people, and yet it's also a development of like singular people, right? Like you choose to embrace culture or not, right? And so the interesting thing is if you look over history, right, the idea of violence, which I would, in some regards, you kind of look at as the antidote to empathy, or empathy is the antidote to violence, right? I don't necessarily agree that love is the antidote to violence. I think empathy is a better word for it.
It's an action.
When you look at that, violence has historically gone down throughout history, right? 100 years ago, we lived, 150 years ago, we lived extremely violent lives, right? You look at the Industrial Revolution and just how, I hate to use the idea of oppression, but that was real, tangible oppression where people were actively trying to control people. Where I think in today, I think we struggle with this as a society as we look at people that are, holding power over us. And I certainly know that there are people that are probably abusing that power. And we could probably look at Putin today as he's one of those people. But I think we get lost in the weeds of looking at people today saying these people are trying to control us. They're trying to be violent against us. They're trying to be oppressive. When the reality is that maybe, and I don't know, I might be wrong here, but maybe these people are trying to help. They just don't know how. And so there's this misunderstanding or this miscommunication of empathy, right? Where people are trying to be empathetic, but they don't know how to listen, right? They don't know how to learn from everybody. And so what they do for one side of the spectrum might not be good for the other side of the spectrum. And I think throughout time, we're actually becoming, in many regards, far more empathetic society and culture
because of life and all of it.
Exactly, and we're looking at like the introduction of unions, kind of stemmed the tide of oppression in the industrial age. We look at following World War II and the Great Depression and all of the ecosystem that existed in America and where we are now, the Civil Rights Union or movement, women's suffrage. All of these things have been slowly. There's more empathy there, right? There's more like characteristically cultural empathy, trying to develop a better life for all people. Is it perfect? Is it well set up? Not always, right? But throughout time and throughout history, we're becoming a more empathetic society, which is really interesting. Especially like I look at it now, in our own lives, we can see this. We look at Facebook, we look at Instagram, we look at Twitter, we look at YouTube. Now, I think we separated something with TikTok. TikTok's a very interesting platform to me because it's the first platform I used to talk about this stuff. And realistically, it's one of the first platforms where you see at scale these conversations, right? Where you see conversations about suicide, where you see conversations about trauma, about abuse, about things that were historically not talked about before 2007, right? Certainly you saw it on Facebook, you saw it on Twitter, you saw it on Instagram, you saw it on YouTube, but you've never seen it at the scale that TikTok has the ability to put it out. And so now more people know about these topics. More people know about the brain. More people know about self-development than ever before. And so this access to information has developed, I think, this very highly attuned society to understanding empathy at a faster rate, a better rate. Is it perfect? Is it wonderful? Not always, right? Empathy in itself can be a bad thing. But people are learning and they're learning faster, which to me is a really interesting thought. It's a really interesting kind of direction for humanity to go.
What I see you doing here is you're finding a way of how things may actually belong.
Yeah.
How maybe no matter what we do to try to F the thing up, empathy has its own way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at tribes, right? We started off our species as wanting to come together. We built tribes. Mm-hmm. And now what are we doing, right? Mm-hmm. TikTok is its own tribe, right? The communities within TikTok, I have 580,000 followers. That's my tribe, right? They get access to me all the time. They get to hear about my thoughts, my wisdom, right? In essence, I'm kind of my own chief of my tribe. That doesn't mean I'm right all the time. And that's an important thing for a leader to do, is to understand you might be wrong, but we're doing the same thing at scale now, and we have different access. And so we're creating good societies or bad societies based on who's leading the tribe and how we're leading. And I think right now what social media is doing is more than ever before, people are accountable, right? Because if I say something that's profoundly wrong, my followers are going to remind me of it, right? Mm-hmm, and, hey, Dylan, you remember when you said this? And I'll be like, shit, you know, like, yeah, I was wrong. Or I might deny it because I might be a terrible human being, right? And I don't want to go down that route. I don't want to take personal responsibility, but I don't think you can get away with that like you could 50 years ago, 100 years ago, right?
What I
It's
love you
different
said,
now.
what I love you said earlier about Putin, you said perhaps he's just trying to help in an interesting way. Now, something that I learned years ago is that a human being actually never chooses to act his problem or her problem. The human being only ever acts from a place of solution. So
Hmm.
let's say if you look at your dad, for example, and if it's too personal, just let me know. But your dad, you as the observer would say that was a problem that he took his life. You as the observer would say the problem is that he took his life. The
I
only thing
used to
is,
say that.
right? You used to say,
I think I agree with where you're going with this though. Yeah, go ahead.
right? The only thing is what he ended up doing, his action it was a solution to the problem of his life. And so
Yeah.
he did this. So one thing that I've become um, very, very anchored to is trying my very best to bring back into my awareness who I've always been. Some people say, what makes a speaker influential? They ask Tony Robbins a question and he tries to explain, and then he gets to the empathy part. And, how do you describe something that is so dynamic?
Yeah.
Love, and like you say, empathy is the action likely of this love piece, right? Um, to lean into and ask yourself, how is this person trying to help? We go back in time and, sometimes when we're quite distant from a horrific situation like Hitler, we can say Hitler is trying to help. And though that's demonstrous to say, but at least he's not close in relation to us in
Yeah.
time like Putin is. Putin is pointing missiles at us, whatever. So we're feeling
Yeah.
the threat of a little more. And so perhaps let's play with the Hitler concept. And we're thinking, perhaps he was trying to help.
Yeah.
And when we navigate that piece, so this is what I'm interested in or interested in. How can we as society finally adopt, and as a people, that we don't get through things and say we got through in spite of, but we prime ourselves towards that all of life will be life, and that we assert into life that we are looking for how it belongs. We become curious.
Yeah.
How is this their solution? Because here's the thing. I think we do everything, and I think you may agree, I don't know, but we have a primary desire, and that's love, to give and receive. We do everything because we reckon if we do this, it'll be one step closer to love. Some people just say, I'm going to kill myself, and it's one step closer to the love that I've been needing and feeling and haven't felt. I'm going to go to this utopia place. What's your take on it?
Well, I want to go back a little bit because I think this is an important thing to build up into. I think what you really developed there was this idea of rationality versus logic, right? Where, where we like to look at things from our own solution kind of conceptualization, where rather than the problem. And I think looking at it as a solution is a cause and effect idea. And so I look at rationality very much as every feeling you've ever felt is valid, right? So if you have a feeling, you oftentimes make decisions when you're younger to counteract that feeling, right? So if you're sad, you cry, and that brings you attention, right? That brings you love, that brings you support, brings you empathy, if you will. But at some point, you realize that when you cry, you don't get that attention anymore. Some people will look at you and say, stop crying, get over it, right? Because you're now at the age where you need to start being logical. Is that something worth crying about? Is dropping your pencil on the floor a logical reason why you should be throwing a tantrum? Or maybe you can use your words and ask to pick it up, right? If you can't reach it, right? And so at some point, there needs to be this development of you need to understand your own problem and determine whether it's something you should rationally react to or logically react to it. And so when we get to more of your conceptualization of this, and now I'm kind of losing track of the question. Can you remind me what was the final question?
I think I left it open-ended. The spin that I threw forward
Yeah.
is that we all act our solution, And
Right.
how can we, and I think just to paraphrase, how can we make room for what people are doing is actually what they consider to be a solution? So how can we empathize with that and not have this hypervigilance towards
Right.
judging, is it good or bad, is it safe or not, but how
Right.
can we actually embrace what they're doing and look to the encouragement of them taking courageous action? Now don't get me wrong, Hitler killing a bunch of Jews, I wouldn't say that I'd be like, hey, good job for being courageous, on and on. The only thing is, what can we, so now I'm getting more curious, what can we align with? And maybe there was a certain style of leadership that he said, listen, if my life gets taken from me, I'm okay for dying for this cause. You and I, like I could just like, I can pick up your energy here. You and I are more than okay for dying for a cause. I can tell.
Mhm.
You would give your life for this cause, you would do it. I think if we choose our suffering, we all know that there's certain things in our life that we just cannot let go. Like I'm picking up from you that you can't let go of this topic. This is just who you are.
Right.
You are just in this space, right? Relentless pursuit to help society. And I think there's something in our life that doesn't let us go. And it's at the core of who we are. And when we lean into that and give our life to it, we're more than okay. If our life ends
Right.
early, it's early.
There's with I think with this idea, and I think where I was going with the idea of rationality and logic is that there's this interdependence that I think we forget to develop in our lives. And I was having a conversation with a very good role model, I would say, now in my life. He's a blind man. His name is Maxwell Ivy, and we had a conversation on my podcast about a week ago. Um, and he talked about this trip that he took from Texas to New York back in like the 90s, before internet, before any disability kind of support really, I think, took hold in America. And he talked about talking to people and saying, hey, can you guide me to this place? And he would put his hand on their shoulder and they would walk him to places, get him on a train or get him, situated in a seat or something like that. And he looks at this idea and he's like, this is interdependence to me. It's, I can't necessarily give anything back to these people, but I can, connect with them. I can be kind to them. I can be compassionate to them because they're taking care of me. And I think when we talk about logic, when we talk about rationality, when we talk about leadership, like all of these kinds of things have an interdependence on people, right? You look at me and you say, Dylan, I think where you're going with this might be wrong. It's my responsibility to understand that there's some piece of what you say that has truth. And I think this is a really big struggle in talking about mental health because what our parents have often taught us, right? If you have abusive parents, you have narcissistic parents, they might say to you, you're worthless or you're not valuable. And essentially you craft that personality at times. You develop yourself to be that very thing, invalid or, not valuable, worthless. And then what we struggle with is the very truth that we have created that. We are a piece of that. That choice is important. And so, it's so important to understand that interdependence on people, right? But the reality is in that situation is that you were interdependent on people that didn't know how to offer it to you in a positive way, in a way to develop you rather than control you. And that's, I think, the really important, significant difference that we need to kind of hone in on when we have these conversations, especially when we're talking about things like Hitler and Putin. These guys are terrifying, right? And they should be. And we should interdependent on each other. We should look at each other and come together as a consensus of this is, categorically wrong. It's not right to go to war. It's not right to murder millions of people because they don't fit your description of what is a perfect human being. That's not right. And so, it's a large conversation, but we can dumb it down to where we are now in very simple terms of in your family. If someone looks at you and says, you are the worst human being ever, there's very small pieces of truth because they're trying to tell you the truth. They wouldn't say that for no reason. They say that because they want you to be the worst human so they can justify their own actions.
And it's our
They
job to fight for the sliver of truth. That
and
that's
so
what empathy does, right?
right.
Exactly. Go ahead.
And so part of us needs to look at that and recognize there's pieces of me that are wrong, that are bad. And that goes for any human being. What we don't realize is that that person that's looking at you has pieces of the worst human being out there as well. And so we disconnect from that idea. And but when we reconnect with it and we start understanding, okay, my mom said I was worthless. But what she didn't realize is that she's also kind of worthless because she never taught me how to be a human being. She never taught me how to be a functioning adult. She never taught me empathy. She never taught me love. She never taught me kindness. And so I've had to learn all of that on my own. And so that makes me not worthless because I'm able to care for and support people in a way that my mother couldn't. And so we start connecting the truth of she wanted me to be worthless. But then we look at her and we realize part of her was worthless, and then we start creating that empathy. I think is what is important in this mental health journey is that you look at your mom and you're like, well, she didn't have a mother that cared for her. She had a mother that beat her and told her she was worthless. So maybe she got that behavior from her, right? And so she just crafted my experience based on what her mother taught her how to do. And that's not excusing any behavior, right? That doesn't excuse Hitler's behavior, Putin's behavior, your mom's behavior, your dad's behavior. It's just a way to empathize and understand that you don't need to look at that relationship and say, this is the worst thing in my life, right? I look at my dad's decision at this point in my life and say, it's the most important thing that's happened to me. Mm-hmm. It's not bad. It's not good. Mm-hmm. It's not great. It's not perfect. It's just the most important thing that has brought me to this point of being able to sit with you, having this conversation, overthink all the things I overthought all my life, right? And be able to help at this point millions of people, right? I've had videos go to like 3-4 million views. I've got like almost 4 million likes on TikTok. I don't care about the numbers. What I care about is that I've impacted those people to a point that I think I've helped them. And now I've become interdependent with them, where I look to them to help me understand how to help human life, and they look to me how to help their own lives. And that's an interdependence that's very important. That's very valuable, because if I'm going to be a leader, I need to know what people need help with. How can I help them lead?
Love it. I think we're all looking for people to make safe the thing that we have appointed as dangerous or perhaps unneeded and unwanted. And it's those things that they say and I'm going to botch this probably real good, but they say the definition of love is, let's say I'm impatient. The definition of love is, I don't like my impatience, so I want to give it to you. You don't want it, but you take it. Why? Because you see it's difficult for me. So you just say, hey, listen, it's safe with me. And you onboard it. And then I get to observe how you handle both my impatience and the impatience that we all have to some degree. And when you reflect back to me that it's safe inside of yourself, you give me a perspective and you invite me to not push away this impatience, but to let it serve me and be like, it's safe with him. So to integrate it. So all I'm hearing you say constantly is you're bringing integration. So you say good, bad, but then I listen to your primal story about your dad, and ultimately he committed suicide. But like you say, it's not good or bad. And so one of the things that we do on the weekly wins and losses channel is we bring the realization that though you might feel positive about certain things at a certain time or negative, polarity is needed. But when in relation to a win and a loss, it seems like people have these bloated appetites for just wanting to judge, is it good or is it bad? My wife shares a little story. I'll just share it real quick with you here. Yeah. So for example, I was raised in a Christian home, very conservative, but I've deconstructed my faith. I now allow, it sounds really ridiculous, but hey, you know what? Love to me, God, creator, if you call it universe, you call it what it is, fantastic. But when I think about, there's a story in the Bible, whether it's true or a poem, I could care less. It's a beautiful story. And it talks a bit about, so there are these two people created, Adam and Eve. So two cells, I don't know what it is, but two humans, for example, a
Yeah.
male and a female. And they're in the garden and they have everything they want. But then God says, this figure, the source says anyway, don't touch that. They find that tree, they find the apple on that tree, and they decide that they would like to decide whether this is good or bad. Why should we wait for somebody to tell us what's good or bad? And so they take a bite. He takes a bite. He probably eats the whole apple and gives her a crumb. Like, I'm sick of this. Like, she did it to us. Like, come on, this is ridiculous, right? Anyway, so this is about the story of life, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to judge what's good or bad, you will be thrown out of the garden on a daily basis. See, we as humans, we think we were thrown out once and we cannot stumble back into the garden. The truth is, at any point in time, we want to get rid of that toiling part. As soon as they're out of the garden, they had to go and create their own food and on and on and on. If you ever want to create hell in your life, if you ever want to be about toiling, you will decide what's good and not good. So what's bad and good. You will do goodies and baddies.
Yep.
And that's dualism. And
Yep.
dualism never works because we can see in your journey, like you said, it's not good or bad what happened in my dad's life, in how I had even on board it. It is. So it's like, here's the thing. When I think ultimately at the base of who humanity is, and I like to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure.
A human, including slaves back in the day. So I have no reference for what this is. I've never been a slave, but I can only imagine. You hear stories of what they went through. They say that a slave, even when treated the best by the master, because there was some slave apparently that would sleep next to the master's quarters and they'd have all the good food and the good bed. They say that even though the slave is treated like a king, basically, when the master was gone, the slave would still seek to flee and would. There's this concept about autonomy. It's like you are you and I am me.
Yep.
And if you try to convince me, or if you don't have to do much, you don't have to do much at all to threaten. And so that's survival place, my autonomy. My question to you is, what do you think is at the base of society? The question that's not being asked that would actually help us understand and bring clear.
Yeah.
What creates mental health, abuse, trauma, self-harm? What is it that we as you and I could do that wouldn't contribute to the problem of making people feel small, worthless? What is it?
I think I can look to animals with this, and I also want to refer to a book that I'm still reading, but I think it's a really remarkable book. And I think so. The book is When the Body Says No, and just by the title, you can kind of already understand. But I've had two rescue dogs in my life, and these animals were so much different. If you've ever had a rescue dog, you already know the behavior of a rescue dog, right? That dog doesn't ever want to leave you, right? And why that is, I think, is the idea of a cage, right? And a cage can be so many different things. It just doesn't have to be a physical cage, but the control of a human being, the control of anything, putting anything into a cage of some sort forces that body, right? And I'm not even talking about the mind, but the body to respond, right? It forces that animal and my dogs, right? For the first time in their lives, when I took control of them or took ownership of them, they became more or less free, right? And for the first time, they recognized that they could have love, right? When you raise your hand to them, you don't see this at first, right? Because they cower because they're expecting the control. They're expecting the domination. When you raise your hand to them 10 years later, they don't do that anymore, right? Because they recognize their own freedom, right? And they're not slaves to the human that controls them. I look at people the very same way. It's like when you raise a hand to this person, when you raise your voice to this person, when you raise your judgment to this person, when you raise your sense of control, right? And I think parents do this a lot. And I even struggle with it because I'm a parent, right? We try to tell our child what to think. We don't teach our child how to think, right? We don't open up the possibility that we could be wrong and that they could be developing a sense of righteousness, right? Where they realize that through technology, through the times, through cultural development, that they might have a better answer than us. We try and tell them how to use our answer to succeed. And in a sense, it's written in all of our laws in America. It's written in so many different places, but I think the answer to your question is freedom, right? When you give the person, and I do this in my work, when you give the person to just freely become themselves in front of you, you give them an opportunity to be who they need to be, right? If it's wrong, that's okay, right? Because this conversation that me and this person have, alone, it's freedom. It's freedom to be wrong, because then we together, because I ask the right questions and I help them understand the perspective, right? I'm not trying to tell them how to think. I try to help them understand what is right for them to think, right? What do you think is right? And we have these conversations to a point where maybe I am wrong, right? That's what they say to themselves. And they recognize the freedom to choose that answer, right? Whereas before, it was out of spite for their mother. It was out of spite for their abuser. It was out of spite for their ex-husband or their addicted father, right? And so this concept of recognizing your own freedom is the most important thing I think you can do for any human being, is that you give them the opportunity and the right to just be who they want to be for a moment. But that doesn't mean you don't hold them accountable. It just means that how you operate in the conversation is focused on interdependence rather than control. And I really like that idea of interdependence, of being able to say, what I say to you here, I also need to remember that I'm going to be, friends with you tomorrow, right? I need to be friends with you tomorrow. What I'm not trying to do is make you my slave for tomorrow. And I think a lot of people don't recognize that how they interact in a conversation can be very controlling, coercive, manipulative. It can be all of those bad things really easily, because they're trying to tell people how to think and not, getting curious. Like, you're asking me so many great questions. You're not trying to tell me how to think. You're asking me how I think, and you're making your own deductions based on that. And I love that.
It's a fascinating play when we think about so listeners, ask yourself the question, perhaps, Dylan, I'll do the same thing. Where is it in our life, in your specific life, where you think you're helping, but in reality, what you're doing is you're controlling people to the finish line, and it's your finish line. So what you're saying is, well, life has happened and society is in me. All kinds of generational stuff is in me, and it's good, bad, different. It's not anything other than it's just experience. So I happen to think that this might be helpful if you would take this at a base note. Then our child comes along. I have a 17-year-old, 15-year-old. So for listeners, Dylan, ask, right, your child comes along and you realize this little bugger is going to do exactly what he or she wants to do.
Yep.
And you realize the autonomy. You don't have to go about the work of becoming a slave master.
You can.
But
the interesting thing, right?
You start realizing that freedom, though you crave it, you have a story in your brain, because interprojection, there's a stage of your life when your parents project into you, and it's a good stage typically. But unless you find a specific time in life where you switch that into a different note, instead of you saying, they will give me meaning about who I am, and so this whole debate here, what you're bringing forward, I'm not telling you what to think. Think about, parents, you listening to this talk. Think about what Dylan's just saying, how to think. Ask yourself, parents, even if you have a friend or a spouse or a partner or someone you're dating, what kind of courage does it require for you to literally be okay with surrendering their autonomy back to them?
Yeah.
And you're encouraging them how to think, which will create perhaps distance, meaning difference. It's not really distance, sorry, but it's difference from your opinion. It's designed to draw you closer. But ask yourself, people say often, right? People often say, listen, we have a lot in common. And I'm going, and you're basing your connection on that, aren't you? And so we have this narrative. Listen, if I say to people, and if I'm with people and I say, listen, I'm just here to debate how to think, and we don't put any restrictions on what they should think about, it's we release them to think about whatever it is, and we're going to realize, holy smokes, these people are very different than me.
Right.
They have a similar attraction, which is love and connection,
Yep.
but they're very different. Go ahead, I
And
can
that,
hear you're just bubbling.
well, it brings me back to a conversation I had with a client of mine. And so the idea of physical abuse, right? Like you talked about slavery before, and it's so remarkable that you have this conversation and this comes to mind. This person believed in physical abuse. And I'm not surprised at all, because physical abuse to a child is remarkably effective, right? I'll never disagree with that, because I was there. I've been abused. Like, for after my dad died, the next man in my life, that's what he did. He disciplined me, right? So when I did something wrong, I was hit with a belt from the small of my back to my calves, basically, to the point where I couldn't sit down in chairs at school. Sometimes I had to like sit on my hip or something. So it's remarkably effective, but the effectiveness is misunderstood, right? And what you're talking about is this freedom to think what we want. Well, when you physically abuse a child, what do you think they think about, right? And this is a question for the listeners. Obviously, I think, James, you understand this. When you physically abuse a child, do you think this child is free to think about whatever they want? I think absolutely not. They think about why they were hit, right? And sometimes they don't think about why they were hit, because trust me, I know this, I've been there. Sometimes they think about the hitting. How could my parent do this to me, right? How could, they ask the questions of, I don't understand how this is love, right? For some reason, parents don't think that children can think at that level, but they absolutely can, right? And sometimes we create this necessity to think at that level because of things like physical abuse. And so it's really remarkable that we have this conversation, because we try to control children, and it scares us to death as parents to think that if we don't control children, what could happen? Well, the reality of what could happen is our children could become remarkably free. And if you're scared of that, that's a really important thing to be scared of, but it's a really important thing to address within yourself. Why are you scared of it? Is it because how you've treated your child, their freedom would separate them from you? Because if so, why? Like, it's a really difficult conversation to have as a parent. But do you want to perpetuate what you've done, or do you want to solve the problem and help your child become a free thinker, recalibrate that relationship to understand your own fault? Because I think that is more beneficial to long-term relationships than control ever will be.
Well, think
And
about
that's a really important thing.
Yeah, think about for a parent. What actually does a parent want? A parent typically, a parent oftentimes will reconcile that the child may live longer than they do. So
I
I
hope
would
so.
suggest, right? Yeah. So I think what a parent wants to know ultimately is that the child will be okay whether they're here or not. Whether I, as a parent, am here or not, but they're conditioning, they're getting their child ready for life, so that they'll be able to take on life, and life is changing. So I think the reality, if we all reason with it, we can see life isn't staying the same. So firstly, as a little piece of humor, it's kind of actually a little comical to think that, well, child, you should think like me. So teach them what to think, because the world is evolving. We don't even actually want them to think, because they're not going to fit in. They're not going to find a way to bring their value to the world. So that doesn't work, right? But to your point on what to think and how to think, it brings to heart for me, child and adult. We all want our children to be free thinkers. We want them to focus on, like you said earlier, how to think.
Mm-hmm.
We have an example in this house. I got a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old, and we have been ferociously, and from day one, not doing what, and Meg and I have been together for 27 years, married for 22.
Mm-hmm.
We were both taught in our homes what to think. Like, the demand of our parents was, here's what you should think. How to think, there wasn't much learning about how to debate things properly. Okay, you're either for us or against us, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there isn't an open debate, right?
Right.
So when I think about a child's life and an adult's life, there's this freedom that we all want for them. However, this freedom comes at a cost. And this is what it looked like in our home about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
My kids were realizing they're free thinkers. And you know what that reveals? They're very different. They
Yeah.
have their own thoughts, but guess what? They don't need to go and tell their friends who they really are. They tell us who they really are.
Yep.
So we're hearing all this stuff about who they are. They laugh and giggle at certain things. I'm like, whoa, I
And
wonder
you're
if I didn't teach
safe.
them the right thing to talk about. But I'm sitting here going, I'm actually a living embodiment now. I'm experiencing what it looks like. Like I said, you're going to have to be courageous as a human, because now they're revealing to me and going, oh shit, pardon the language, but did I not teach them what the right thing was to think about? The only thing is, if I lean back, I become aware that they're pitching and catching ideas in their brain and they're making these inferences. And I'm going, this is kind of beautiful. The only thing is, then I go upstairs and there's my wife, Megan. She's crying. And she goes, I made a big mistake in parenting. I said, how so? She's just having a weak moment. She doesn't really believe it. But here's the thing. Sometimes, and I know you parents out there who've experienced this, you will. And if you haven't, you're going to experience this. If you surrender your children right quick to autonomy,
Yeah.
you're going to come to an experience where you're going to probably question, have I done my job on the what to think part? But I want you just to lean in, and I want you to discover that the how. Look at, I taught my kids how to debate things. And actually, this is how the story ends. I said, Meg, Rowan is 17. Rowan has never had an appetite and a craving towards things like drinking, drugs, anything. Objectifying women, nothing. And I said, come Sunday, come the weekend, if her and I go away for the weekend and we say, you guys want to come with, we'll drop you out of a friend's house. You know where my kids love being? It's so weird. My kids are not homebodies, but my kids love being at home. Because I think this is an environment where we showed them that the optimal place of leadership is when you develop how to think and not to feel pressured.
Yeah.
And so now I get to live in this space. So I don't know if you have any comments about that, right? But yeah, go ahead.
It's safety, right? You've created a sense of safety within your children to think they can come to you, right? Like, and I loved how Jordan Peterson brought this at one point. He talked about thinking, right? Like thinking is how you kill ideas, right? Well, thinking is how you kill ideas if you're a person that doesn't know how to talk about ideas, right? And so if you have children that come to you and bring maybe stupid ideas or ideas that are crazy or ridiculous, and you have a conversation with them safely, right, where you don't judge them for it, of like, maybe that's not the best idea. Have you ever thought about that? Like, why would that be bad, right? And then they have the conversation with you and you debate them, and then they start to realize maybe it's not the best idea. And you've created a sense of safety where they can actually bring you crazy stuff, stupid stuff, right? But think about a child that doesn't have that.
Real crazy, stupid things, real things. This is what's going on in their brain. They don't have to suppress this and just go and talk to people in private about it. They get to do it in the home.
Right. And if a child doesn't have that, what do they do? They either, one, internalize it. They craft this illogical, but rather rational response to the situation that they're in. Maybe they've been abused, and they craft this idea that they need to control every aspect of life. So maybe they become OCD. Maybe they become, maybe they objectify women. Maybe it's a young boy that becomes objectifying women because their mother didn't protect them from their abusive father, right? Or whatever. Like it becomes so many different scenarios. Maybe they become a psychopath and become a serial killer, right? That's the extreme end. But these ideas that do not get to be discussed, that do not get to be debated in a child that doesn't have the ability to express themselves, regardless, become major problems later in life. And so when you, as a parent, create the sense of safety like you undoubtedly have, that's incredible. That's giving children, especially like myself, I never had that, right? It's not, and it wasn't necessarily my mom's fault. It was, my dad had this issue. He ended it in a way that made me feel shameful, that I felt like I couldn't talk to anybody. Had nothing to do with my mom, really. My mom was empathetic. She was there. She was present. She tried to be supportive. She brought me to therapy when she thought I needed it, but I didn't speak, right? And so this one situation made me choose not to speak. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't create the environment, which my mom ultimately did. It just took me a lot longer than normal, right? And
Isn't it so interesting
ultimately,
how go ahead, sorry.
well, and ultimately, my mom and I now have conversations that are remarkably deep. We've talked about my dad, we've talked about her, we've talked about, even now some of the struggles within our relationship. And there's going to be struggles in every relationship. But now she's become a safe place because she doesn't necessarily, judge me in any capacity, and I don't judge her. And there's this interdependence. I love that concept now, is developing that interdependence of recognizing, James, even in this conversation, you're here to debate my own ideas and say, you know what, Dylan, I don't necessarily agree with that. And me as well. It's like, you have me on your show very much for this idea that I want to learn more. You don't do it just for no reason. Like, you're curious, you want to know. And so this idea of communication is so fundamentally important for our understanding of what is, how do we create right and wrong? How do we develop our own values? How do we develop our view of the world? Because James, you might have something I don't know, and I might have something you don't know. And the more we connect, the more we start understanding that. And that's where it's at.
I think that's when I reflect on what you just said, I'm just going to reveal in real time. So this is what's stirring inside of me. Sometimes when I hear you say problem, I think to myself, but it's a solution. So what's happening inside of me is what's worked for me is the term solution. Because if I'm a problem, if it's all going to be that I'm the problem, then how can I ever get any courage to do something? So this is just what works for me.
Sure.
So while this works for me, then I have this offering. It seems like a nudging to maybe, and you know how this is how it is in life, right? Yeah. We think maybe of something to teach the other. And I'm laughing right now because have you ever realized that the body, you don't need to teach the body really much. The body knows. The body doesn't lie.
Right.
So I used to tell my body that my Aura ring said that you're not going to be very energetic today because it says score X. Now I know I didn't buy the ring for that mechanism. There's a certain point in time when it's like, hey, who's at the authority and at the controls of this being? Me.
Yeah.
So I will tell myself how I'm feeling, meaning I will listen to how I'm feeling and then I'll go with that.
Yep.
Well, when I think about it, there is a moment in time when, like, again, the Aura ring said energy should be X. And I said, oh, that's really cute. And you know what I realized? I was going through a health journey at the time. And I realized the funny cuteness of it all is the body can't lie. And I was trying to inform my body. That this little device, it's really kind of nice.
Yep.
But that this device is going to tell my body what's going on. And my body, I never forget, one of the days it said, today's a day for resting. You didn't sleep well, and you're not energetic. It was time for my 10-minute precise workout. My friend, the freedom that I felt, and I went to the device, and it's like, yes. And I started working out. I felt amazing. So it's like this. When I hear what you're talking about, it's like I'm wrestling with how not to bring something to you that isn't of value. Because if it works for you, if it's a solution, I always look for, are there places where maybe you're running into trouble? Then I'll offer another invitation or coax forward, because there might be something that you can, if you want, adopt, not in my way, but it might strike you. Because one of the things that I wrote down, I'll be totally honest, as you were talking, I wrote down freedom to hear our solution. So you think about the child. If you don't give them a safe environment to debate and express, like you said, then I think what it does, it gives us the freedom to hear, it gives them the freedom to hear what their solution is, even though it sounds silly. And us adults would say that's a problem the way you think. And then what it does, it stress tests us or them in real time by allowing us to contemplate and mature what we just heard. And instead of being right or wrong, it allows us just to reflect. So the child could just reflect instead of being like, oh, I said the wrong thing in the problem. So what's fascinating, it's like what I'm revealing here is you're there and I'm here. You and I might be thinking alike, and listeners, you're probably picking this up. Subtly and very subtly, I'm controlling him to the finish line if I'm not careful with his comment. And that was never my idea. My
Right.
idea is to say, if he suffers, just like you, Dylan, when you recognize that when people suffering, you want to help them with their suffering, but only if they want to. And you said it so clearly before. If you don't want to talk about suicide, no problem. But if you want to talk about it, then I have a perspective. But how would you, I'm curious on this, because I have my own approach. I just
Sure.
revealed what was happening in real time. But how, what right do you, what right do you declare within yourself that will say, I give myself the permission to step in here and insert this thought? Is it to shift? Is it just to say it? Is it just to share your story?
This kind of comes to some of the issues I have with therapy in general and coaching in general, because I think we approach it from a very, what we think is unbiased, because I think we like to look at the science. I think therapists like to look at the science. I think coaches even like to look at the science and say, science tells us this. And I just don't like that, right? That's that, it almost looks back at like how we've looked at science in general and say, okay, because we know what science does now, we now can predict that science is perfect for the rest of our lives. And that's just not true. Science changes within, minutes, sometimes hours, sometimes days, years, decades. But what I think I know, I always assume I'm wrong, right? And so when I present an idea of like, here's this thought, what I'm usually trying to do is one of two things. One, I'm offering my relatable experience for the piece, right? I'm not trying to take over the conversation with my story, right? What I'm trying to do is relate this idea of this is how I did it. Now that doesn't mean they have to do it that way, but this is an idea. And then
That's
not only,
congruent with the how spot in your life. Sorry to interject, but
right,
that's congruent with the how. You're not saying
right,
what, you're saying this is how I did it. I'm just sharing.
right. And the other thing that I do is very much like, if I know the science, I explain what I think the connection is to how they're thinking, right? So when we look at this idea of rationality versus logic, like oftentimes people, we talk about trauma, we talk about triggers, we talk about, fight or flight mode. We have this conversation of, what, this is what we know or think we know about the body. And so I explain this idea. And so this might be relatable to how you're actually feeling right now. And so I never present an idea that I think is, this is the thing that's going to help you. I never present that. I hate that. I grew up with that
Likewise.
salesmanship
Yeah.
idea of, you need to do this, solve your trauma in 3 easy steps. I think that's bullshit. It's, trauma is so individualized that it can't be solved by this quick, easy fix. And we get so caught up in it. And so it really needs to be this discussion. It needs to be this open forum of, have you ever thought about this? Right. And so I ask so many questions. And by the time I say anything of any kind of bias or opinion, it's with so much information, right, at this point, that this is what I think is necessary here. But I don't know. Right. And I'm always clear about that. It's like, I don't know what's right and wrong for you. And so I very much give this emphasis of, what I'm here to do is empower you to think through your own solutions and think through your own problems and develop your own understanding of you. Because, quite frankly, you've lived with yourself longer than you'll ever talk to me. Right. And so you know yourself, you're the expert on you. So act like it. Right. So start developing yourself through the understanding of how we talk here. I'm going to dig into questions that you've never been asked before, because you've never revealed to anyone the stuff that you're going to reveal to me. And I craft that relationship of trust first, because that's the most important thing here. Is I develop trust so much to the point where people, at this point, people do a free consultation. They tell me everything, but then I'm like, why would you tell me everything? Right. Clearly there's something that you have not told me. And that's the funny thing, is like, people come to me and they might trauma dump, give me all the information. But then I'm like, why do you feel comfortable giving me all the information? What do you leave out? Right. If you're emotional about this, there's a connection there. But if you're able to express to me all of this stuff unemotional, that's not the stuff we need to talk about. Right.
Hmm.
And so I just
Yeah, the
understand,
easy stuff.
right.
Yeah, yeah,
I,
yeah.
I,
We got
I
to keep digging.
understand
Yeah.
that part of people to the
Hmm.
point of
Hmm.
let's dig further. Right. And so I'm not a, I'm not a coach that's going to sell you all sorts of crap. Like I'm not here to solve your problems. I'm here to help you solve your problems if you want to.
Think
Right.
about how boring life would be if your role as a coach, my role as a coach is to try to churn
Yeah.
people into us. Oh my goodness, just stop.
Right.
Like,
No.
honestly, no, 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 no. This is exact opposite. Like, if I think about your style and my style, and listeners are probably picking this up, him and I are very similar, but him and I are very different. And I don't know if you just picked up. So I got this thing on, I just revealed the solution talk, and he's got the problem talk. If you're picking up, the problem talk works for him, the solution talk works for me. Have you noticed that him and I are not having a difficult time connecting right now?
Yeah, not at all.
Zero. If anything, it's like, dude, bro, it works for you.
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
Like, amazing. And I think, yeah, no, you've really laid it out in a really nice, perhaps we'll have to do a part two sometime. I would enjoy
Sure.
this. It'd be good.
Yeah.
Tell me, before I let you go, I'm really curious, right? So sometimes people, when they hear, well, he's a coach here and he's a coach and he's a speaker and he's got all these TikTok people, man, that guy's probably really wise. And sometimes people end up resenting these really wise people, right? And so for you and I, we understand that coaching, if anything, it's a really humble profession.
Oh yeah.
Because if anything, what it does, it reveals all the things you don't know. And
Right.
actually, the only thing it does, it conditions you to become a really good listener. And then
Yep.
maybe, if you spend enough intentional time just listening, you might have about one or two things that you can bring to the surface, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And so you try your best there, right? But if I were to ask you, and I ask a lot of people this on these shows, but what's one area, Dylan, that you can honestly unpack for us? First label what it is, or just mention what it is, and then unpack how you struggle. So, what's the area in your life that you struggle in most right now? If you be honest, you struggle
Oh,
there.
it's a
Like,
that's a very good question. Um, Quite frankly, I think what I've always struggled with, and it goes back to my childhood. It's always been silence, right? Like even now, it's why I'm here, right? Like it's very much why I'm here. Why I feel like I need to express a lot of this stuff. And I write about this in my book. I have a whole chapter on expression. It's part of this is me practicing the very thing that I'm weakest at, right? It's expression. I feel, for so much of this journey, because I've been an influencer for a year or for 2 years now, or over 2 years now. The thing that I've always struggled with is expression. I still, to this day, right? I hate pulling out my phone and making TikToks, and it's not something that I really reveal all that often, because it's not normal for me to pull out something and tell my ideas to, right? I don't, especially problems, right? When and I've done my own episodes of talking about my own grief. Me and my wife went through 3 miscarriages before the pregnancy
wow.
she's on now. And thankfully we're having a baby in June, but that baby's not here yet. And so there's always that idea of, for me, that struggle for me to express myself and share, like, I'm struggling. And that's why I practice this. This is why I come on these shows, and I,
Good
have my
job.
own podcast. I did a whole episode on grief, on my own grief, of talking about those miscarriages. I think that was before. So my grandpa had died not long after that episode, and I hadn't really talked about that. But during that one podcast episode, I really revealed a lot of things that I was struggling with. I was like, those 3 miscarriages. I lost a soldier to a firearms accident, like a week or two before that episode. And so one of the things I think I'll always struggle with, and I understand it, that I will, is expression. It's the idea of silence, because I'm very comfortable. My body and my mind are very comfortable in silence. And so I counteract that. I defy that in my own way, because of, my book kind of, I follow my own advice as much as I can, but I think I'll always struggle with it. But I think that's the struggle that I need to continuously stand against of, don't fall into the 20 years of silence that I fell into after my dad's death. Um, and I'm so grateful that I have the wife that I have. Um, I have the ability to teach my stepson what I'm learning, and helping him understand my own experience, not necessarily telling him how to feel, but showing him that this is what can happen if you remain silent. And he knows about my suicide attempt in 2015. He knows about my dad's suicide. And we've had that conversation, and we've had so many significant conversations about this very topic. And that's always something I think I'll live with and struggle with, but I think I have continuously developed that to be something that I work on. It's a great question.
Good on you for walking straight towards your discomfort, choosing to initiate it every day. It's like a powerless power, not powerless in like a dystopic way, but it's
Yeah.
like, how is it that the very thing that I feel like it's been sent to take me down, when I express myself, I feel like I almost feel like a version of not enoughness. But I'll tell you something, we entrain ourselves. It's like we entrain ourselves to our spouse. We begin to love everything about them because we fantasize about them and not all the other ladies out there or men out there, whatever
Yeah.
that ends up being. So I listen to your story and I think to myself, here in front of me is Dylan. And Dylan had a situation in his life, his dad, suicide. Dylan attempted suicide in 2015. Dylan has decided that the one thing, the pain and suffering in his life, he's going to let that serve a purpose. And he lets it serve a purpose, perhaps through realizing, when you express things, you take the power away from it. The power of darkness, if there's this draw towards it in an unhealthy way, it's like you make available and you express, and all of a sudden your heart becomes lighter. And ask yourself the question. This is so fascinating because here's what's interesting. Your unborn child, whether this goes full term, I sure hope and pray that everything works out for you and your wife. Awesome, good job. Think about this. Even your stepson. Your dad passed away. There you are. You sit today. He passed away like that, like earlier we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It was a bit of a problem. But when you think about what's happened for you now, my friend, you've taken that story and you've allowed it to mature. You've redeemed it. The creator of all goodness is always redeeming everything back to itself. There's a purpose for everything. Look at how present you are. Look at how you are resilient. Look at how you're showing up and you're saying, listen, expression, silence kills. You got to open up and talk. And what's fascinating, it's changed you because I've been on this talk with you, and there's not many people that I also feel like this abrupt nudge in me that says, James, stop talking, because they want to say, I feel like you've actually trained yourself to want to talk. Yeah. And it's a really interesting concept, my friends. I think you are transforming, and this pain and suffering is all doing it for you. So not in spite of, but because of. And it's like, how could we be so grateful for the thing that literally my dad committed suicide and it's now it's a gift? How is it so? My friend, you've come through that part. My friend, I got so much honor for you. It's just beautiful. Good job.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, James. This was a great conversation.
So Dylan, where can people find you?
DylanSessler.com, TikTok, and TikTok, but you can find me every other place in the social media platforms. But yeah.
Do you want to spell out your name just so that people have that as a capture?
DylanSessler.com.
That's wonderful. Dylan, it was my pleasure. And again, perhaps we'll have to do this another time, but you are another person who has chosen to show up in the world. And I thank you for being so authentic and so vulnerable. I was waiting for this talk for a long time. I was going to wear a baseball hat today because thinking you might, but you know what? This is the first time that I wear these earmuffs, but now I realize I can wear these earmuffs over top of a hat. So that's really nice. Lovely. Awesome. Take care, my friend.
All right. Thank you.
Until next time, folks.
I sincerely hope you enjoyed that little interplay. If you like the podcast episode, let us know by subscribing, leaving a little review, and sharing with a friend as you feel appropriate. Honestly, the guests that I host on this show love the feedback, and I love knowing that you're listening. Now, whether you choose me as your guide or not, that's simply great. And why, you ask? Well, because you're the one. You're the one, and you're one of those people that's listened to the very end of this podcast. You've clearly made a decision. It's obvious to invest in yourself. And how isn't that just the best news? If you decide you need and or want, one, to get unstuck by activating your creativity and inner resources, two, see things clearly, three, get to your next level, or four, live with vibrant energy and passion, or perhaps all four, go to www.jameshepner.com for one-on-one coaching, and or go to www.weeklywinsandlosses.com for the no-charge Friday noon global community weekly wins and losses video call. So again, I thank you for investing in yourself. See you next time.
My sincere hope is that you've gleaned a few nuggets for yourself and a few pieces of interest that help you move forward in your unique journey. So again, I thank you for joining me here. This is James Hepner clocking out. Until next time, peace out, rock up.